When you call a function in JavaScript and you pass in some values in the call, right in between the round brackets, those are called arguments, right? Or are they called parameters? And if they are parameters, then what's the difference between formal parameters and actual parameters? Let's take a closer look. Okay, so you've probably heard the word argument and parameter more than once, maybe many times. But the difference can be a little bit unclear. So let's clear up any confusion between the two. First, function definitions versus function calls. All right, so to better understand the difference between arguments and parameters, it's helpful to think about the difference between function definitions and function calls. Let me explain what I mean. The function definition is the place in the code where a function is defined. That's where you're going to see the body of the function. A function is defined in one place, somewhere in your code base. A function call, on the other hand, is what happens when the function executes. So unlike the definition, which is a single place in the code, a function call is something that happens at a particular moment in time. And when a function is called, it's called with a particular set of input values. In JavaScript, those input values are what we put in between the round brackets of a function call. The point is that you might define a function in one place, but you might call it from multiple different places in the code. But not only that, you might call it on multiple different occasions with different input values every time. So that brings us back to our two terms. What are the parameters of a function, and what are the arguments of a function? The parameters of a function are the set of inputs that are defined in the function definition. So, based on what we were saying, that the function definition is a single place in the code somewhere, the parameters exist in that one place. The part of the function definition that lists the inputs right here is called the parameter list. In JavaScript, the parameters are basically just the names of those inputs. But they're not always just names. They can also contain default values for each parameter. Here's a function that defines 3 parameters. And what's more, the last parameter here also includes a default value. That's the part that's introduced with the equal sign. And if you're using TypeScript, then there's more. The parameters can also define their data types, but we'll come back to that. So that's what we call a function's parameters. Arguments, on the other hand, are the values that we pass into the function during a function call. So now we're talking about the specific moment when a function is called. And in that particular instance of a function call, the values that we're passing, those are the arguments. They are the values that we place inside of the round brackets in a call. Here we have some literal values being passed. Those are our arguments here. But here's something to keep in mind. These values can be different from one function call to another. In fact, we might not even know the arguments ahead of time. They might come from some expression or from some variable, which could be different every time the function gets called. But we can know the parameters ahead of time, at least their names and possibly their default values. Formal versus actual. So what's up with these other terms you may have heard of? Formal and actual parameters. Well, let's go back in time for a minute. Today, the words argument and parameter are used pretty consistently and usually pretty clearly. But it actually used to be more confusing, and you can still sometimes encounter the older usage of these terms. So I want to talk about how these terms evolved. Back in the day, in earlier programming languages, and for example, in the early versions of the specification of the C language, the word argument and parameter were actually used to mean the same thing. So you can see how that could be pretty confusing. But the way that they were used is that they were referred to as formal parameters and actual parameters. So what today we call a parameter, so in other words, the name of a function's input, was originally called a formal parameter. And then what we call an argument today, the value that you actually pass into the function when you call it, that was originally called an actual parameter. So formal parameter means just parameter, and actual parameter is the same as an argument. Is this clearer or more confusing? Well, I'll say this, I kind of like the word actual because it's easy to remember that it refers to, well, the actual value being passed. So if you remember only one thing from this video today, Here's the trick to memorize it. It's based on the letter A for argument and for actual. An argument is the actual value passed into the function. But the C language specification, by the way, no longer recommends using the word formal and actual. Instead, it just says to use the modern naming conventions and to stick with the words parameter and argument. Now, let's go further back in time just a little bit. Where does the word argument come from? I mean, when I think of the everyday meaning of the word argument, if I forget that I know programming for a minute, I think of the idea of an argument as people arguing over something, right? But the word actually has a meaning in mathematics, and that meaning is older than computers and than programming. In mathematics, an argument refers to the input to a mathematical function, which is kind of like a function in programming, but mathematics does have its own definition of what a function is and its own rules about how functions work. So we won't go into that. But here's something interesting. The origin of the word argument before mathematics is actually from the science of astronomy. The use of the term argument developed from astronomy, which historically used tables to determine the spatial positions of planets from their positions in the sky. These tables were organized according to measured angles called arguments. That's from Wikipedia. So it turns out that sometimes there's actually a lot of history behind even some simple words that we use in programming. The argument's object. One specific place where the word argument shows up in JavaScript is the argument's object. This is a feature in JavaScript where anytime you're inside of a function call, there's a magic variable that exists called arguments. It's a variable that basically contains an array of the current arguments to the function. The arguments object gives you a different way of accessing the arguments. For example, by their index, or it also allows you to iterate over all of the arguments. It's not very common to use the arguments object today, and it's a pretty old feature of the language. In fact, you can only use it in classical functions and not in arrow functions. And you can get some of this functionality in better ways instead, like using REST parameters. A REST parameter is indicated with the 3 dots or the ellipsis, and what it does is it collects multiple arguments into one array value. Here's a function that uses a REST parameter. It'll accept multiple arguments and put them all into this one array, here called values. So that's actually an example of a feature where you have one parameter defined here, and at the same time you can call the function with multiple arguments. So it's a reminder that the parameters and the arguments don't always have a one-to-one relationship. Default function parameters. The other situation where the parameters and arguments don't have a one-to-one relationship is when you use default parameters. A default parameter is the default value that you provide for a parameter. This value will be used if no argument is provided when you call the function. I said earlier that the parameters are basically the names of the inputs. But is that all that they are? Let's look at what happens if you're using TypeScript to define a function. Now, even if you're not writing TypeScript, I'm going to show you some TypeScript here because I think that it can be really useful to better understand plain JavaScript too. In TypeScript, we can define more than just the names of the parameters and their default values. We can also define their data types. This makes parameters actually much more useful. Now, by defining the parameter types, we can make the function check if the arguments that you're going to provide are of the correct type. In this example, I have a function where the first parameter is defined as a string, the second is defined as a number, and the third can be anything, and it's defined as the any type. So the type checker, which is part of TypeScript, is going to use this information when it checks the code. And that's another thing that a function's parameter list can do. So that gives you a pretty big overview of parameters, arguments, the differences between them, and how they work. You're watching JavaScript with Marek. My name is Marek. I've been writing JavaScript for over 10 years, and my goal is to help you become a top JavaScript programmer. So what should you watch next? Check out the video being featured on the screen right now, or go to the description below to get more of my content, and I'll see you there.